Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The topic this afternoon is Christianity credible? In order to answer this question, we must first define what we mean by Christianity and what is meant by credible. By Christianity, we mean the belief that the historical Jesus of Nazareth was the divine Son of God, the Savior of the world. This implies several things. There is a theistic God. 2, divine miraculous intervention into this spatio-temporal world can and has occurred in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. 3, that what Jesus Christ taught about his being the Savior of the world is true. We will attempt to define only the first two, to defend only the first two. If they are true, the latter point follows from them. Secondly, what is meant by credible? We take as a working definition of credible that 1, a belief must not involve any necessary contradictions, negative criterion. 2, that it offers sufficient evidence to establish its truth as opposed to competing views, positive criterion. Now, with these two criteria for credibility in mind, let us proceed to examine the alleged evidence in support of the two essential tenets of Christianity, namely theism and the miraculous intervention of God into human history in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. First, the credibility of theism can be measured by both criteria. All attempts to disprove a theistic God have failed. No one has shown that it is necessarily contradictory to believe that there is a God. Theism is not like believing in square circles. Theism is logically possible. There might be a God beyond this world, and it is impossible to disprove this logically. In point of fact, attempts to prove a theistic God is logically impossible have been as colossal in their failure as have been purely ontological attempts to prove that God's existence is logically necessary. Theism is neither logically impossible nor logically necessary. In fact, mere logic cannot prove existence of anything, for it is always logically possible that nothing ever existed, including God. This same logic applies to anyone who would attempt to disprove God by way of the problem of evil. The argument is circular. As one former atheist, C.S. Lewis, pointed out in his book Mere Christianity, the only way to prove that there is ultimate evil or injustice in this world is to posit an ultimate standard of justice beyond this world, which is self-defeating. This ultimate norm of justice is what the theist claims God to be. Hence, one must suppose there is a God in order to prove that there is no God. And if the claim is not that the evil is ultimately unjust, then one might say that it is ultimately just, and hence cannot be used to prove that ultimately there is injustice in the world. In brief, God cannot be disproven by way of the problem of evil. And since the existence of God is neither logically impossible nor logically necessary, it remains to ask whether God's existence is supported by enough evidence to make it more credible than his non-existence. We offer the following evidence for the affirmative answer to this question. The evidence that makes the existence of God more credible than his non-existence. First of all, it is more credible that the world is designed than it happened by chance. The apparent order and design of the universe, with the intricate adaptation of means to end, is either the result of intelligent advanced planning or else it happened by sheer chance. That is, the universe, with all of its regularity, orderliness, and adaptation, is either a happy accident resulting from blind chance, or else it is the result of an intelligent mind. That the chance alternative is unreasonable may be readily seen. First, the chance of getting a 6 by rolling one die is 1 in 6. The chances of getting 2 6s with 2 dice is 1 in 36, and the chances of getting 3 is 1 in 216. Or to change the illustration, the 5 letters W-O-R-L-D can spell 120 different words. That is, if the letters were tossed into the air and fell in a roll, the chances that they would spell the word world is 1 to 120. Now multiply this by the trillions and trillions of particles of the universe whirling in space several billions of years ago, and ask yourself, what are the chances that the world would have taken shape out of these whirling particles? Believing that the world happened by chance is like believing that Webster's Unabridged Dictionary resulted from an explosion in a printing shop. It is possible. Of course, this is logically possible, but it's highly improbable. In fact, it is unbelievable. It is incredible. A perfect bridge hand might result from tossing the deck in the air, but it's much more likely if an intelligent being is dealing with a stacked deck. Likewise, the atomic dice of the material universe give every evidence that they've been loaded by an intelligent being. A remarkable indication that the chance hypothesis is unbelievable comes from the world-famous humanist Julian Huxley in his book Evolution in Action. Huxley calculated that over the known time scale, at the known rate of helpful mutations, the odds for total evolution happening by chance alone are so infinitesimal to be negligible. He writes, and I quote, 1,000 to the millionth power written out becomes a figure 1 with 3 million noughts after it. And that would take 3 large volumes of about 500 pages each just to print. He adds, quote, no one would bet on anything so improbable happening. How could anything so unlikely ever happen, you may ask? Huxley's reply is natural selection. In brief, in order to overcome the stupendous odds against life developing by pure chance, Huxley invokes a blind natural force and invests it with a kind of divine intelligence. The simple truth of the matter is that the chances for the world happening by pure chance are so unlikely that even atheists find it necessary to create their own God to explain the obvious design in nature. Secondly, either there is a God or else there is no explanation for our existence. The famous non-theistic philosopher Martin Heidegger said the most basic philosophical question is, quote, why is there something rather than nothing at all? That is, why do I exist when I don't have to exist? My existence is not necessary, for I might not exist. But I do exist. Why then do I exist when it's not necessary that I exist? What is the ground of my existence? There are several possible answers. One might say that I am the ground of my own existence. But the atheist Jean-Paul Sartre noted that self-caused existence is impossible. To cause one's own existence, one would have to exist prior to his own existence, which is impossible. Another possibility is that my existence might be uncaused or ungrounded. But this is obviously not the case, since I am not a necessary existence, and therefore I must be a contingent or caused existence. For as even the skeptic David Hume wrote, quote, I never asserted so absurd a proposition as that anything might arise without a cause. But that is precisely what the atheist must assert, that the universe arose without a cause. It is much more credible to believe that it arose as a result of a cause. Thirdly, either there is a God or moral obligation makes little sense. It is axiomatic that men have moral duties to one another. Moses, Jesus, Confucius, Buddha, and virtually all other moralists recognize that men are under moral obligation to do good to each other and not evil. It makes little sense to say that the Nazis were morally wrong or that Eichmann did evil to the Jews unless there is a moral law by which they are being judged. Nor does it make sense to make value judgments about civilization unless there is beyond civilization a standard of good by which it is to be measured. Likewise, praise and blame, condemnation and commendation have meaning only if there is some standard of right and wrong by which they are to be judged. It is interesting to note in this regard that atheists are often the loudest protesters when the principles of justice and human rights are being violated. This is very strange indeed if there is no moral law which is being violated. Why should men like Clifford and Huxley be so finicky about the truth if there is nothing in the world except matter and their feeble lives? Their carefulness becomes fully rational, however, if there is one to whom their dishonesty becomes disloyalty. That is, unless there is a God who lays upon us the moral obligation to follow the truth, it makes little sense to insist that one should be loyal to the truth. Secondly, not only is it credible to believe that there is a God, a theistic God beyond this world, but if there is a theistic God, it is credible to believe the claims of Jesus Christ. Once theism has been established as credible, then the claims for Christ's divinity become meaningful, and they can be examined to see if they are truthful. This, too, involves the use of both negative and positive criteria. First of all, the miraculous intervention of Jesus Christ in history is not impossible. David Hume's arguments against miracles are answered once you have established that it is a theistic universe and established that supernatural events are possible. Secondly, Jesus Christ and the claim to be the Son of God, predictions in the Old Testament about his coming, his life, death, birth, and resurrection are firmly established by history. There is more historical evidence that Jesus Christ lived, died, and rose from the dead than any event from the ancient world. F.F. Bruce, in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable?, establishes that the New Testament documents are the most reliably copied and composed documents from antiquity. What do they tell us? One.
I have to stop you at this time.
No, you only have 10 minutes.
That's only 10 minutes. I get
Yes.
5 more.
10 minutes.
5 to go.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you. The New Testament documents tell us that Jesus Christ claimed to be the Son of God, that he claimed to be God Almighty in the flesh. He said, I am God, I can forgive your sins, I can raise the dead, I will judge all men, I was eternally existing, I am the Jehovah of the Old Testament. And he said, I will verify this claim by rising from the dead. That Jesus Christ rose from the dead has been verified by more historical eyewitnesses from the contemporary period than any event from the ancient world. Over 500 people saw Jesus Christ, handled him, talked with him, ate with him on 8 or 9 different appearances over 40 days. They died saying, I know that he is the Son of God and has risen from the dead. No event from the ancient world has authentication such as the resurrection of Christ. Skeptic after skeptic, who with an open mind has looked at the historical evidence, has been converted to Christianity. Lord Littleton, Sir William Ramsay, Frank Morrison, who wrote a book, Who Moved the Stone, researched in order to disprove Christianity. In the process of his research, he was converted to Christianity because he saw the evidence for the resurrection of Christ was overwhelming. Our case in brief is this. 1, there is a theistic God, it is credible. 2, miracles make sense in a theistic universe. 3, the unique miracle of Jesus Christ supports his claim to be the Son of God, and if he's the Son of God, when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no man cometh unto the Father but by me, then his claim is true. Thank you.
Michael Scriven.
There's one slight problem about this version, which is that in the course of being invited to this, I was given a lot of warnings about how I was not under any circumstances to get off into general discussions about the nature and existence of God. And I was told both in letters and on the phone that the topic of the week and of this debate was to be the following, I quote the exact words, the credibility and validity of the claims of Jesus Christ. So, although there's a tremendous overlap and you won't feel that we're talking about different subjects, I want to explain why that is what I have very specifically kept to. According to the records we possess, Christ made claims of several kinds. It's important to distinguish between these kinds of claims because some kinds are true and others are not. One kind of claim consisted of moral assertions. These were sometimes simply repetitions of the moral doctrine of the Essenes or of previously accepted moral teaching, but they were sometimes very sophisticated moral points that went beyond that. They were often expressed by means of parables. There is no doubt that the Christ of the Gospels is not only a subtle moralist, but a gifted moral teacher. It is a tradition which has not been very well observed by his 20th century disciples, from Bishop Robinson and Billy Graham to the popes. Not that they ignore morality, it is rather that their efforts in that direction ignore the welfare of man in the name of the dry husks of doctrine, or abandon any semblance of order or objectivity in morality, as situation ethics from Bishop Robinson would have it. But Christ was unlike some moral teachers, such as Socrates or the Buddha. He, like the Prophet Muhammad, felt that he had divine inspiration for the morality, and indeed he felt that he was himself divine, the Son of God, and not just God's messenger. We might call these claims, a different type of claim, theological. They included more than just moral claims and assertions about his own divinity. For example, they included advice about how to get into the kingdom of heaven, and claims about God's nature and wishes. These claims are all false. Or if you want to dispute the categorical simplicity of that flat statement, we can modify it to say that the claims are, on the best overall judgment of the evidence available, not sufficiently likely to be taken seriously once the evidence has been carefully examined. Of course, they must be taken seriously at first, because they are of the greatest possible significance. But similar claims are made by vast numbers of people, and one needs unusually good evidence to justify any special attention to them. Father Divine in the U.S. and the various gurus from the East now favoring us with their presence are only the latest in the long list of those who have attracted a following with such claims of divinity. The question is simply why most Christians think these leaders are charlatans or at best deceived, whereas they think Christ's similar claims should be taken seriously. The evidence for the truth of Christ's theological claims is of some interest, but not really as good as the evidence for Uri Geller's talents or Edgar Cayce's powers. There are two fatal flaws in the evidence for Christ's divinity or for the divine origin of Christ's actions. The first is that the written record postdates the formation of the Christian sect and is set down by leaders of that sect. There is simply no way in which one can take very seriously, I do not say that one should entirely ignore, accounts of miraculous events when they are contaminated by the clouds of memory and, it is a separate complaint, written by those whose career and self-concept is tied to the impressiveness of the stories. How seriously would one take an account of the Watergate follies if it was written by Nixon in his declining years when one had absolutely no corroborating evidence from politically neutral or alien sources? How seriously, to make the matter worse, if the account were by Ziegler, Nixon having died at an assassin's hand? And how seriously if, in addition to Nixon's innocence, Ziegler claimed that Nixon had miraculous powers? One would be more inclined to be impressed if Ziegler was an expert investigator of the paranormal, or even an experienced one. But Ziegler is the fisherman of our time, a simple peasant with the analytical powers of an ad writer. And he is hopelessly biased in favor of Nixon by virtue of his position and dependence on Nixon's favors. And if he waited 20 years to write, by which time he headed a Nixon cult, we would have a right to treat his credibility as negligible. At least in the case of Geisler and Cayce, we have contemporary evidence. And we have considerable evidence from people previously skeptical about the allegations and convinced by their own personal and direct investigation. In spite of that, I will venture to say that the membership of the Parapsychological Association, the only organization of trained researchers into the alleged supernatural, would vote about 80% against the assertion that either of these individuals have any paranormal powers whatsoever, although it is widely and popularly believed that they do. Of course, Cayce, like some Christian Science practitioners, possibly Oral Roberts and certainly a great many MDs, was a master of psychosomatic medicine, and Geisler is a good magician, but not one with paranormal powers. However, the problem with the credibility of Christ's divinity is so serious that even if one accepts the New Testament accounts of the miracles and resurrection as correct descriptions of what happened, they could not possibly be accepted as correct explanations of what happened. And of course, many of Christ's theological claims were claims about the explanation of those and other events in divine terms. There are two ways one could approach the task of establishing the hopelessness of these allegations of divinity. One might look at the whole range of evidence studied by natural theology and conclude from that, as it is clear in my view that one must conclude, that there is no God of the kind that Jesus was talking about, and hence that there's no way Jesus could have been his son. In fact, the evidence is overwhelming that there aren't any gods even remotely like the God of the Gospels or the God of the Old Testament, male or female, so Jesus wasn't her son either. To take this approach would lead us too far afield at this point in the discussion. May I congratulate Dr. Geisler having taken that approach in the time that was available, and I'll get to comment on that in a moment. Perhaps we'll have time to go out to those matters in more detail in the discussion that follows this exchange. I'll be here for quite a while if you want to keep on with the discussion. I'm here to deconvert you, not just to talk at a philosophical level. The other approach to this second source of difficulty with Christ's theological claims is simpler. We can just look at the simpler explanations that immediately present themselves if we assume the Bible's descriptions of the miracles is literal, which of course we shouldn't do except for the purpose of argument. The naturalistic explanations of the miracles, which many skeptics have struggled so hard to make plausible, are more or less excluded by this assumption. I think they probably should be. Since they involve saying that the loaves and fishes, for example, were all there someplace all the time and so on. That, however, by no means entitles us, the exclusion of the naturalistic account, now by no means entitles us to the theistic explanations. It only entitles us to paranormal explanations, of which the most promising candidate would appear to be the assumption that Jesus was an individual with quite exceptional powers like those of the people studied in paranormal psychology, people with powers such as the power to heal, levitate, read minds, predict the future, and so on. A set of people who, across the course of history, have been enough to generate the whole science of parapsychology, the study of just such paranormal powers. It's essential, of course, to distinguish between the probability of the theistic explanation of Jesus' actions in the light of the evidence available to Jesus and the probability in the light of the evidence available to us. I think that Jesus' explanation of his own powers, assuming they were as reported, was pretty good. Sometimes some idiot at discussions like this threatens me with the dilemma of either saying that Jesus was a liar or accepting what he said as true. Since it's pretty obvious that he wasn't much for mendacity, it hardly leaves me much choice. The problem is much simpler. There's a third alternative. It is that he made the best possible explanation of what struck him as events calling for a supernatural explanation, but as a matter of fact, he was wrong in making that bet. And although he did have paranormal powers, they were not divine in origin. Personally, I very much hope that the biblical accounts are more or less true, since I think the world would be a much more interesting place if some humans have such powers. I've recently seen reports from the huge Pentecostal missions to Southeast Asia that walking on the waters, turning water into wine, and the resurrection of the dead are occurring again on the island of Timor. I sincerely hope so, but a lifetime of work on the investigation of the paranormal leads me to add that the chances are almost negligible. And from the fact that whenever we can investigate such claims, the most recent nearby one would perhaps be the psychic surgeons of the Philippines, the results are negative. From that, we have to conclude that relying on partisan reports written a couple of thousand years ago by untrained observers working from memory and not direct observation is absurd. One has to conclude that the credibility of Christ's theological claims, his supernatural explanations in the usual sense of supernatural, meaning divine, is, after careful study, essentially zero. The validity of the claims, as opposed to the credibility, is best estimated from the evidence for them, which we have been considering under validity. Excuse me, under credibility. The two issues come to be the same issue in this case. One must conclude that the validity is also near zero. But perhaps the Christian is wrong to focus on credibility and validity. I well remember the state of shock induced in me when a distinguished Lutheran theologian, Dr. Paul Homer, once said to me, this is essentially a quote, "It isn't even important whether Jesus lived or died, let alone whether he was the Son of God and performed miracles. All that's important about the gospel," he said, speaking as a Christian, "about the story of Jesus is that it creates the possibility of a way of life. In short," end of quote. In short, the concept of Jesus as an inspirational myth. One could do worse. Inspiration we do need. Irrationality we do not need. The moral example of Jesus, the moral precepts and parables, are impressive indeed. He was a man of peace, but not a coward. A man who had the courage of his convictions, but would not support a war in their name. That cannot be said of Christianity as a whole, and it can be said of very few Christians. We have much to learn from him, even if it isn't theology.
like you to start the rebuttal.
Yes, some of Christ's claims, we are told, are moral. The essential moral teaching of Christ has value. I would like to suggest that the following logical summary might be concluded from that, which would be contrary to the conclusion drawn. If Christ taught the truth, and Christ taught that he was the Son of God, then it is true that he was the Son of God. If Christ can be trusted with respect to his honesty, with respect to his morality, then it seems to me that when he is presenting a straightforward, clear, unequivocal truth, such as the truth about the inspiration of the Bible, the truth about his saviorhood of the world, and the truth about his own divinity, then what argues for the morality of Christ's claims argues for the authenticity of Christ's claims. Secondly, it seems to me that we have an entirely straw man picture that is being posed. I agree with at least 90% of what Dr. Scriven has said about parapsychology, about other so-called miracles. None of this, however, applies to the resurrection of Jesus Christ and to his claims. The differences are, one, the life, death, and resurrection of Christ was predicted by prophecies hundreds of years in advance. This is not true of the claims of any other religious leader. Two, Jesus Christ claimed to be the Son of God and proved it by his character. The great skeptics and atheists, almost without exception, have acknowledged the morality, the integrity of Jesus Christ, and if you acknowledge that, then you acknowledge the truthfulness of his character. Three, no other world religious leader, or for that matter person, has ever predicted his resurrection, which has been verified by eyewitnesses, over 500 of them, over a 40-day period of time, who personally were skeptical, not partial to believe it, with the tendency to hallucinate, but were skeptical against them. No other person has made the claims, the prophecies have been made, or proved it by the resurrection. Hence, Hume's second argument against miracles is answered in that we do not have canceling miracles supporting other claims. Thirdly, it seems to me that there is an entire misunderstanding of the authentic basis of Christianity in terms of the documents. These documents have the shortest gap from the time of the original of any book from the ancient world. The earliest copies of the New Testament come from the very first part of the 2nd century. The usual gap for a book from antiquity is 1,000 years from time of composition. The amount of manuscripts of the New Testament are 5,000. Tacitus has 2 manuscripts. Thucydides has 8. The Peloponnesian Wars and most great classics from the ancient world survive on about a dozen manuscripts. The New Testament has more manuscripts, more accurately copied, 99.9% accurately copied compared to, let's say, Homer's Iliad, which is 95%, or the Mahabharata, which is 90% accurately copied. The New Testament is the most accurately copied, the most well-documented and authenticated book from the ancient world. I refer you again to F.F. Bruce. So we do not have this many years later, bad witnesses, poor evidence kind of support for Christianity. I would suggest also that they did not have to depend on memory. They were eyewitnesses. Virtually every writer of the gospel narratives were eyewitnesses and contemporaries of the events that occurred, so that when we say that Christianity is unique and the claims of Christ are unique, we mean historically verifiable in terms of an actual person who lived, proved by his character that what H.G. Wells said is true. I am not a believer. I am a historian, but this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irresistibly the center of history. Renan, the great skeptic, said, if the life and death of Socrates is the life and death of a sage, the life and death of Jesus Christ is the life and death of a God. And if this man was wise and godlike and moral and proved it by his character and the resurrection, then he has the right to be believed. He is credible in the claims that he presents. Thank you.
Let me pick out some points that Dr. Geisler made in his original presentation and then refer to the ones that he's just made. The first point he made was that one can't show theism to be contradictory by appealing to the existence of evil, because this would be a self-refuting argument, since it would consist in saying there are things that are evil in the world, and we know those are evil, and of course we would then have to have standards of evil in order to establish that claim, and the standards of evil presuppose the existence of God, which would show that we've already got God in order to refute this particular claim about God's existence. It's not a very promising argument. After all, it does just assume that the only possible foundation for ethics is religious, and there are, after all, in the world today, a majority of human beings who live under ethical systems which are based upon humanitarian considerations or utilitarian considerations, and which lead to very, very similar results to those that you find in the Ten Commandments or in the New Testament, and which work perfectly well as social control systems in this country as in other countries, so that one can hardly assume that they automatically are committed to the existence of God. Certainly not as far as they're aware, but supposing one argues that they are really and truly, how would one make that stick? How can one show that there can't be good reasons for having a rule about driving on the left-hand side of the road, or good reasons for having a rule against the breach of contract, independent of the existence of God? There are obviously good social reasons for morality, and one doesn't need to assume God's existence. That means that the problem of evil problem remains, and does, in my view, show that God, in the strong sense usually involved in the New Testament, cannot possibly exist. The second point that he made is to say that the empirical evidence is very strong, and this is the basis for the theistic claim. The first of his arguments under that heading was the argument from design. And his presentation of it consisted in saying the choice is simply between the universe having its present complexity as a result of mere chance, or there being some designer. If those were the only two alternatives, then his very neat little examples about dice and Webster's dictionary would indeed be relevant. Since these are not, of course, the only two alternatives, the crucial third alternative, the standard alternative, is the existence of a evolutionary process which leads to order in the long run, although beginning with random elements, then one doesn't have to face that alternative. To give a simple illustration of that, hissing is not really a contribution to the discussion, and if you've got something to say, you should say it in the question period and avoid anything. Applause is also not a contribution to the discussion. I would say that the design issue is more like the question whether, if you took a number of small magnets, arranged them randomly on a large table, and then you shuffled them around for a couple of million years, just letting whatever happened happen, would you be really surprised to find that at the end they bonded off in pairs? No, you would not. Would you think that somebody had deliberately been doing it? No, you would not. You would think that, given those forces and the shuffling of a random kind and an initial random order, you will get order in the end. The second argument that he took up under this heading was the cosmological argument, why something rather than nothing, self-caused, is impossible according to Sartre, and therefore I'm interested that you should quote an atheist on this crucial matter, but it seems to me clear that, again, the problem is that there's a third alternative. The third alternative, one of the obvious third alternatives, is the infinitely old universe, which would, of course, have an explanation of a physical kind for every state that there is in it. And if you don't like that, you still feel that somehow the whole thing had to come from somewhere, then, all right, it came from a piece of uncaused matter. Why should one imagine that uncaused things have to be somehow divine? They aren't any more neat as explanations when they've got extra funny properties on top of being matter. If we have to swallow the idea of an uncaused cause, let's make it as simple a thing as possible. Let's at least make it something that we understand in other respects. The third argument he gave is one I've already discussed, the argument from ethics. There can't be a standard of right and wrong and justice, or a standard of truth unless there is a God, and to that I would reply by saying that obvious pragmatic alternatives to that. Then he turned to the question of Christ's divinity and the historical evidence, and he says the best evidence for any event in the ancient world and so on. Two things, very important points to make about this. First of all, the crucial fact about it is that it isn't an event which had a reasonable antecedent likelihood. Supposing we find records written down long after the event that say that the Battle of Thermopylae involved a large number of people on one side and a large number of people on the other side. and that it was won by the people on one side. Well, it had to be won by somebody, or perhaps I suppose they could have both lost. You're not too surprised about that. There isn't an initial antecedent unlikelihood that has to be overcome by exceptional testimony. That is the problem with the evidence for the divinity of Christ. We're not trying to establish that there was such an entity as Christ. We're trying to establish an extremely peculiar, extremely antecedently unlikely explanation of what he did. And for that you need better evidence than the kind of thing that you have of these ancient records. May well be the evidence here was better. But one has to distinguish between the situation with contemporary paranormal phenomena, where the people can go in and look now, record now, state what they see now. It can then be questioned, and you can go back to the source for a further look. However many eyewitnesses there were in those days, they didn't get the record down for a long time. We do not have independent records. There was no possibility of going back to look again after thoughts had come to your mind about possible explanations. Although they were eyewitnesses, they did rely on memory. Those two are not mutually exclusive. It's 20 years at least before the first written record went down, and after that we've got a lot of other trouble. One final comment on his second remark. He said that, I think I've covered most of them in this discussion of the first one. He said that the special feature of the Christian situation, Christ's divinity, is the uniqueness of it, the prediction of it by predecessors of Christ and the predictions by Christ of his own resurrection and so on. I don't think one wants to act as if somehow the fact that something is predicted automatically makes it divine or more likely to be divine. It might be more divine as a result of being unpredictable. It's important that events which intervene in an unpredictable way in the universe are rightly thought to be candidates for divine acts of God than those which are simply predictable. After all, the prophets predicted great natural events. One's not inclined to think that they were supernatural as a result of that. Finally, I'd like to just comment on his statement that a great many, I think he really suggested most of the skeptics who have looked at the stuff, the evidence, what's available, the arguments and so on, have been persuaded. I stand here to deny that not only on my own behalf, but also in the following statement. If you take people who have studied it, the people who teach theology at schools of theology, including my distinguished colleague here, and if you take professors of philosophy that have spent some time on the philosophy of religion and on natural theology, you will, if head counting is your bag, find that most of them think that you cannot show there is a God.
Thank you.